All right, welcome to Introduction to Evolution, Darwinian Evolution. So as we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester, individuals in a population vary, meaning that they're not all genetically identical individuals. And the variation is heritable, because variation that's not able to be passed on from generation to generation that particular trait cannot evolve. All populations produce more young than can survive, and so individuals that are better adapted to the environment will survive and reproduce, and this is natural selection. Individuals are not evolving during natural selection. It's the population that changes generation to generation. The two individuals who get the most credit for the theory of evolution are Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, with Darwin getting the vast majority of the credit for it. But we have to give Wallace some credit. He did independently come up with the same mechanism of evolution by natural selection as the mechanism. He was younger than Darwin. They look the same age in these photos because they were not taken at the same time. Wallace was about 20 years younger than Darwin. Darwin's ideas really were a revolution in biology. Prior to Darwin's ideas, there were some individuals who thought that biological evolution was occurring, and we'll talk about a few of those. But the vast majority of individuals in both science and academia and the average person thought that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. All species, including humans, were specially created, and species did not change or become extinct. But Darwin did not come up with the idea that species are changing, that he was not the first person to say that. He was, however, the first person to come up with the mechanism that we still use today, which is natural selection. Darwin did not use the word evolution. Instead, he called his ideas descent with modification, that change over time was occurring because of descent, meaning generation after generation, with modification, meaning that species will change or populations will change over time based on who survives and reproduces and who doesn't. Later, other individuals started using the term evolution to describe it, and then Darwin did as well. Darwin he came up with some other ideas too that we still recognize him as the first person to come up with these ideas. One is that there's a single origin of life. The fact that if you trace back all life, generation after generation after generation, eventually you'll come back to some first cells that are the ancestors of all life on Earth. And we talked about these cells, the last universal common ancestor, the Luca cells, which probably existed about 3.7 billion years ago. Darwin was the first individual to propose that such cells had existed and that all life on Earth was in fact related, and you could trace back to a common ancestor of all that life on Earth. On the left is one of Darwin, a page from one of Darwin's notebooks. He used to walk around with little notebooks in his pocket and write down ideas and sketches, and if somebody gave him an idea, he would immediately pull out his little notebook and write down what he was thinking about, and this greatly annoyed some of his friends that he did that. But this is a little sketch of the tree of life. And you can see the little number 1 down here indicating those first cells. And then he has the branching bush of life. And he also said that there wasn't a single linear ascent from lower forms to higher forms like some other individuals had proposed. Instead, he said life is a branching bush, and that each species that's alive today is the pinnacle of evolution for its particular branch, that we don't have lower forms and higher forms, that all the forms that are around today are there because they were the best adaptation to their environment and they survived to reproduce. And here's a modern depiction of our three domains here: archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes. Of course, Darwin didn't know about that archaea and bacteria were two separate domains. They didn't have molecular evidence that we have today. So Darwin originally was going to be a doctor. His father and grandfather were doctors. His older brother was also going to be a physician and had gone to medical school. So when Darwin was 16, he signed up for medical school, and which you did back then. You could be a practicing physician at age 20 or 21 back then. So he went to medical school and he hated it. He hated the dissections. He thought setting broken bones and lancing boils was disgusting. He didn't like dissecting corpses, and he didn't even last a year until he knew that he was not going to be a physician. And then he went back home and decided that instead he was going to be a minister, and so he went to college to study ministry and to get a 4-year degree in theology. But while he was there, he started to take science courses, because at the time it wasn't like college today. You could just go sit in on any lecture and take exams on different topics at the end of the year. And so he started sitting in on a lot of geology lectures and biology lectures and going on field expeditions with some of the professors that he became friends with. And he really liked geology, and he thought maybe he was going to go into geology for a while. By the time before he graduated, he knew he was not going to be a minister. He got an inheritance from a family member. I can't remember which family member, a grandmother, aunt, or somebody. And then he realized he could actually go into science, because at that time, if you wanted to be a scientist, you had to be independently wealthy and not need to work, because there was no paid science positions then. So he realized now he had money, he could be a scientist. Then an opportunity came up to go on a trip with a Navy ship, the HMS Beagle, which was a mapping voyage. It was not a warship, although they did have weapons. They were going to map the coast of South America and some nearby islands. And Darwin initially went along as the captain's companion. He was only 21, I think, when he went on this trip. And the captain was very young, and so they were concerned that the captain wouldn't have anybody to talk to because the other officers on the ship were older. So Darwin went along, and he was going to collect specimens. He really annoyed the ship's naturalist, however, and the ship's naturalist quit as soon as they got to South America, and Darwin became the ship's naturalist. So he collected specimens for the British Museum and for several scientists that he was friends with, including a bird expert, which was going to be important later. And he found a lot of fossils, and he regularly shipped specimens home when they got to a British port. And every time the ship was mapping some region of the coast, Darwin would have a week or two to explore inland, and he would hire local guides and go exploring. So here's where they went. They spent most of their time, over 3 years, going around the coast of South America and mapping they went up rivers and mapped the coast. And they spent some time mapping the Galapagos Islands, which were really important to the British Navy as a source of food and fresh water, as were many of these areas. Here, they actually went all the way around the world and then back to England. But most of their time was spent around South America. Some of the individuals who influenced Darwin's thinking, one of the important ones was Charles Lyell, who was older than Darwin. They became friends after this, but Darwin took on the voyage to read the newest edition of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which came out shortly before he left. And Charles Lyell's big contribution to evolution is the idea that the Earth was not just a few thousand years old, but that the Earth was millions of years old. And they called his idea uniformitarianism, which meant that whatever geological processes we see happening today, volcanic eruptions, erosion, earthquakes and the changes they contribute to the landscape, coral reefs building up, that the rate at which those are occurring today is the same rate at which they have always occurred. So that if you have a volcano that erupts every 500 years, and you count the layers of ash, and you count back how many times that volcano has erupted, that you should assume, in general, that everything is occurring at approximately the same rate, and that erosion didn't occur more rapidly in the past. And that led Lyell to the conclusion that the Earth had to be millions of years old, not thousands of years old, as most people thought. He said the geological features that we see on Earth today couldn't possibly have formed in a few thousand years. So that was important because that gave time for Darwin's natural selection to occur. Thomas Malthus, who was also in the generation before Darwin, his most famous writing, the Essay on the Principle of Population, which you can easily find online now for free as a PDF. Malthus is probably most famous for being the first person to prophesy doom and gloom for the expanding human population. He was the first person to really ring the alarm bell and say, hey, the human population is starting to increase exponentially. And when other species increase exponentially, that increase is followed by a rapid decline, usually from disease or starvation. And so he was very concerned that the human population was going to have a famine or a disease epidemic or something that would cause a massive population decrease. His essay on the principles of population is kind of interesting. It was not long after the American Revolution, and he was a Brit. He was extremely negative in this essay about Americans and went on and on about how Americans are a bunch of ignorant peasants who don't know how to farm, and they have too many babies, and they're all going to die. And which is kind of funny. He thought the British model was much better, where you have a lord who owns the land, and they are the educated one who has studied, which crops are better and which animals should be raised. And then you have a bunch of peasant farmers who are doing as they're told. And he thought that was a much better system than the American system, where we had all these homesteaders who were essentially illiterate peasants, just deciding what crops to grow for themselves, and they didn't have a lord telling them what to do. He thought that was a terrible system. Of course, he was wrong. We didn't have a big decline in population for anything. Lamarck was another important influence. Again, he was the generation before Darwin. He was a French aristocrat who was very interested in biology and wrote many essays on the topic. He was one of those individuals who thought evolution was occurring. He didn't have the correct mechanism, but he did think species changed over time and adapted to their environment. We'll talk about his mechanism in a little bit. So he didn't, natural selection was not the mechanism that he used. So he thought evolution had occurred, but he had the wrong mechanism. He thought changes that occurred during an individual's lifetime would be inherited, which we'll talk about that. Darwin's grandfather, the physician, Erasmus Darwin, also thought evolution occurred. He didn't have any mechanism, however, but he thought species changed over time and adapted to their environment, and wrote about that quite a bit. Weirdly, he also tended to write in verse about biology, which nobody writes in verse today about biology, seriously, but that was the thing then. So in South America, one of the things Darwin found was many fossils of extinct species, and one thing he noticed for several different species, especially for sloths and armadillos, was that the extinct versions of these species were very similar to species that still exist in South America today. And he wondered, why did the giant sloth go extinct, but we still have several species of sloth living in South America. The giant armadillos, or this particular one, which we call the glyptodont, went extinct, and we still have armadillos. So why? Why are there these large extinct versions of these organisms, and why did they go extinct? Now, they didn't know about ice ages yet then. That wasn't known. Both of these, the giant sloth and the glyptodont, went extinct coincidentally right at the end of the ice age. the most recent ice age, and also maybe not coincidentally when our species first showed up in South America. Darwin spent a lot of time in the Galapagos Islands, so while the ship's crew was surveying the coastline and figuring out the depths and all that and where there was fresh water, Darwin was examining species on these islands, and he noticed that although these islands are fairly close to South America, that not only did the islands have different species than were found in South America, but that each island had different species but similar organisms, like for giant tortoises and bird species. Probably Darwin's most famous discovery, although not his only one, were different species of finches that took the place or the niche in the environment of types of birds that were completely missing from the Galapagos. So by the time they got to the Galapagos, they had already been all around the coast of South America for several years. So Darwin was very familiar with the birds that were normally found in South America. And what he noticed was that many of the, the seabirds were all the same. He did notice that if you found seabirds on the coast of South America, you found the same seabirds in the Galapagos. But land birds, which are hesitant to fly over open water, and generally, some were completely missing and others were very abundant. So some of the ones that were completely missing were things like hummingbirds and parrots, and woodpeckers, which are all over the place in South America, not found in the Galapagos. But he did find these weird birds that were adapted to the same niches. So instead of parrots, there were these birds with large beaks for cracking open seeds, but they weren't parrots. For nectar-eating birds, instead of hummingbirds, we had birds with long pointy beaks that were not hummingbirds, that were adapted to eating pollen and nectar and fruits. Even a bird that took the place of a woodpecker that was not a woodpecker, that actually used a tool to fish out grubs from underneath tree bark. And Darwin didn't even initially recognize that these were finches because he was not a bird expert. And he sent he taxidermied a bunch of the samples and sent them home to his ornithologist friend. And that individual wrote back to him and said, these are all finches. And they're really weird finches. I've never seen anything like it. So it wasn't actually Darwin who figured out that these were all finches. And that really made an impression on him that in a very similar environment to the closest coastline in South America, which is now Ecuador, that you find very similar ecological conditions, but completely different species. And some species which are found all over South America are missing. Some other weird things that he found were the only marine iguanas known in the world. There are iguanas all over South America. Iguanas are lizards. They do not maintain a constant internal temperature. Iguanas in general are fairly intolerant of cold temperatures. They can't move very well if the temperature gets very cold. And here he found two species of iguana that not only are fairly cold tolerant, they're swimming in very cold water. The water around the Galapagos is quite cold, but they were not drinking fresh water. They ate algae from the bottom, which there aren't any iguanas that do that other than these marine iguanas. And they didn't need to drink any fresh water. They, in fact, excrete salt from their eyes like some seabirds do. He was very impressed by those. The giant tortoises are another one of his more famous discoveries. He noticed that every island had their own species of giant tortoise, and they were adapted to the local climate. So on some islands are drier than others and have less rainfall. And on those islands, vegetation is more scarce. And the giant tortoises that are found there would have these large saddleback shells. And what this shell shape allows these tortoises to do is to reach their really long necks up and eat vegetation that's much higher off the ground than tortoises that don't have these kind of shells. So later he would propose that these saddleback shells evolved specifically as an adaptation to the drier climate on some of these islands. He also found some flightless birds, including this flightless cormorant. We have cormorants here in Illinois. You'll see them swimming in the Fox River. They sort of look like ducks, but their necks are longer. They have pointier beaks than ducks. The ones we have here are mostly black, and they dive for fish. Our cormorants can fly. So this is a flightless species, and that's another thing we see commonly on islands everywhere in the world that don't have land predators. So the Galapagos had no native mammals before humans brought mammals there. So when you have an island that has no mammals, some islands actually have no snakes and other predators are missing. Birds often lose their ability to fly during the course of evolution. So if their feeding is on the ground, or in this case in the water, and the only reason that they were flying is to escape predators. If you take away the predators, if you have millions of years to adapt to the environment, flight is expensive. It's energetically expensive, and birds will lose their ability to fly over many generations given those circumstances. So that's what we have here, the flightless cormorant. Now, one of the things that Darwin used from Malthus was two different types of population increase. That if you have species that are increasing very slowly versus species that are experiencing an exponential increase, if a species produces a huge number of offspring, you have an opportunity for rapid selection, because if a species produces enormous numbers of offspring, for many species like that, like insects, 98 or 99% of the offspring may not survive to reproduce. So the 1 or 2% that do survive to reproduce, what trait do they have that the other ones don't have that could allow them to survive? And one of the things that he observed on his trip was hatching of sea turtles. So sea turtles have some interesting adaptations. So they live in the sea all the time. Only the females return to land to lay eggs. And although females lay eggs on different days, the sea turtles hatch simultaneously. And what he noticed was that with these simultaneous hatches, that the turtles that did not hatch simultaneously, if they hatched a day early or a day late, they did not survive. They were eaten. And even during a hatch, the sea turtles that were the fastest, that made it to the water first, got eaten. The ones that were slow or didn't stay with the group got eaten. So he saw this as enormous selective pressure to maintain the population that would hatch simultaneously and stay together as they made their way to the sea. And he saw this as a way that generation after generation, you end up with these sea turtles that almost all the hatchlings hatch on the right day and stay together as they make their way to the sea, because those are the ones that are most likely to survive. And any that don't do that have an almost 0% chance of survival.